from you all as well, and we'll get going. So welcome to session number 1, Language Access for All. We're going to be spotlighting and talking about language access planning over the course of the next 4 workshops hosted by WESD with us at Linguava coming in to provide support. On the bottom of the screen, you can see my name is Daniel Halberg. I am actually a certified healthcare interpreter for Spanish, and I've provided community interpreting services for school districts throughout the region, as well as I now work within Linguava providing training and implementation support. I'm bringing as my contribution to this conversation a language access advocacy role, answering any questions you have about services or questions you may have about translation and interpretation. And I'll be guiding you through those parts of our conversation today. From WESD, we have our co-facilitators, Sean Aker. Sean?
I might actually defer to Maria first. She's
Oh, okay.
a specialist.
Yeah, Maria, please.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Lenzi. I'm the Education, Inclusivity, and Innovation Specialist here at the WESD. And I'm part of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Department. So I am here both to learn more about language access plans and be here one part to learn with all of you. And also to offer some support with any equity lens as you all are building your language access plans, and to just be with you. So if you want to support using equity lens for the language access plans and anything that I can support on the equity, diversity, and inclusion part, that's what I'm here for.
And so my name is Sean Aker. I appreciate everybody being here. I appreciate the support from my colleagues at Linguava and for Maria Lenzi for helping setting this up. Yeah, as a student success coordinator and bringing my background from school administration, this was always an issue, language access. I can't tell you how many times I wasn't able to pull a staff member to do the translation when somebody or the interpretation when somebody walked in. Asking my colleagues who were, paid a stipend to do the interpretation, and then reading the interpretation or the translation. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up these words. Reading the translation myself and saying like, that's not how I would say it, or that's not how this family would receive it well. And then there was inconsistency. And then always being worried about if I used a third party, how much would it cost, and having no controls over that, having no system in place. And so when I had the opportunity as the Student Success Act coordinator to look at this and ask some questions across the region, what are folks doing for language access? And over the last 3 or 4 years, we'll get to some of the issues that have come up, but this is such a need. And I am like, you can probably feel my enthusiasm through the ethers here, but just the fact that we've got so many folks from districts on this call ready to do this, there's no teeth behind it. This is not a state mandate. This is not a federal mandate. Yes, there's civil rights behind it, and the integrated plan talks about it, but you are choosing to do this to set your district apart, to create a better avenue. And we'll talk a little bit more about the numbers in just a minute here too. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Daniel.
Thank you, Sean. And I would be remiss if I didn't introduce you all to Sarah Olsen. Sarah, you want to pop in real quick? Oh, your microphone's not coming through. No. While we're waiting for that to hopefully start working in a second, I'll do a quick introduction for Sarah. Sarah is the account manager for WESD and for all of the school districts within the umbrella of that region. So many of you have probably reached out or had communication with Sarah in the past. She is your go-to contact for any questions you have about your specific account for your district. She's also just a wonderful human being with a wealth of knowledge from both the scheduling side from her experience in that capacity, and also having spent a few years with our interpreter relations department. She is a fountain of information that you can always turn to here on Linguava's team. So let's go ahead and move forward. Oh, Sarah, I think your voice came through.
It's working. I literally didn't touch anything. I just stepped away and it did something different. That was a lovely introduction. Mainly just wanted to pop in briefly so that those of you that haven't met me or interfaced with me directly before had a face to put to my name. And it's nice to see some of your faces as well. So I may not stay through the whole thing, but I am always available to support you if anything comes up. So
Thank you, Sarah. All right, well, let's talk about first our workshop goals, the objectives that we've set for this 4-part series on language access planning. Starting with today's session, we're going to be talking about and understanding why language access is imperative for the students and their success in their academic careers, as well as for the families that are dependent, again, on language services to best support those students on their academic journey. One of the things we're going to be focusing on is defining what local needs are. When it comes to language services, no district is the same as any other. Each has its own unique language access fingerprint. And we're going to be working with you all and asking you all to come back and work with your constituents to define what those local needs look like in each of your districts. Talk about some of the use cases that may extend and be shared through the academic calendar, and then talk about solutions to those needs and those use cases. With all of those pieces in mind, by the time our workshop series has ended, our goal is for you all to co-create with your constituents a tool or a language access plan that defines the policies and procedures for your district in terms of engaging with the families that have a non-English language preference in their homes and the students, and having a way for staff to be able to turn to that resource or tool to know how and when to deploy those services when there is a need. We are monitoring the chat, and while obviously this is being recorded for folks who aren't present, we do want to encourage you all, if you have questions or thoughts at any point during the conversation today, to feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in with live questions, or if you prefer, Sean, myself, and Maria will also be monitoring the chat for any questions that pop up. Sound good? Great, thank you. Love seeing faces. I can't tell you how many times I've been in sessions like this and I get a lot of black screens, so I appreciate you all being here. Okay, so what's our agenda for today's session? Let's start off strong. The first thing we want to do as a group is to review what the current landscape is. We're going to be talking about that throughout the WESD service area, but we also want you all to ask those questions internally. If you've brought some of that information to you, you can share it in today's session as well. If not, we're going to ask you to identify some of those current landscape components in each of your districts. We also want you to review what is currently available in terms of resources that you have within your districts, how they're being deployed at this moment in time as a baseline before we've engaged with this language access planning process. In addition to that, as you've identified those resources that you currently have available, we're also going to ask you to turn an introspective eye on what is currently happening and identify areas for potential improvement that we hopefully address through this process. And with all of that in mind, we want to plan with the end in mind. What is that end goal? A tailored solution for your district's needs, a living document that is able to accommodate the fluctuating populations that we support with academic services and with language services across time and the regions that you all represent. How does that sound for our first session? Great. Love the thumbs up. Love it. It's awesome. Let's keep it moving.
Hey, Daniel, if I can just add real quick, our
Absolutely.
director of communications, he is like super, he's been influenced by language access for all so much so that it's going to be our communications, that's their initiative for the next year, is language access for all. He is so excited on behalf of all of you who are doing this that he's actually creating a quick note or almost like a PSA that you can share with your superintendent or that you can share with your board to say, this is what we've created. So, I mean, this is really setting yourselves apart. So, you know, and I want to say that on his behalf. He'll be joining us in a future session.
Thank you for that, Sean. And that's a great pivot point. Sean, I'm going to pass it to you if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what the current landscape looks like.
Yeah, thank you. So I started doing this, you know, several years ago. And so this particular number came about. This is outside of Salem Kaiser, nearly 11,000 students, families. are speaking a language other than English. This is from the Home Language Survey 2018. So granted, this data is a little bit old. Nevertheless, when I look at the data that we just pulled today, I just wanted to share this with you. So the 5 of you, these districts, not including Woodburn, who might join us later, and North San Am, who might join us for the next one, or they're intending to join us. All of you represent 10,713 students altogether right now. Now, this is unvalidated, right? So it's just currently what we pulled out of the Oregon data suite. So 10,713 students. Any guesses as to how many students have marked a language other than English, either individually for your district or collectively for the 5 districts represented? Any guesses? I'd love to hear.
6,500.
Ooh, that's pretty good. That's a high number. That's a high number. I'll give you a hint. It's a little lower than that.
John, what's the question again?
The question is, how many students do your districts represent collectively who speak a language other than English, according to the current data in the Oregon Data Suite?
How many different languages are you meaning?
How many students speak a language other than English?
Good question. 3,500.
65, 35, 45. Okay, we're getting closer. So it is 2,743 students that are represented. Oh, we got Ann Adams here from Amity. I did not include her. We got 2,743 students currently in your districts speaking a language other than English. Now, to the extent at which they need specific language access, I don't know those things, but I'm hoping that as we go through this process and you all get curious, these are some things that you'll be looking at. But that's 25.6% of the 5 districts that registered for this event today. And Anne, welcome. Thanks for being here. We're just getting started and we're recording this, so we can give you the video after we're done.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Anne's from Amity, everybody. So that's the first part of my spot, and I'm going to turn it over to Maria to talk a little bit about the civil rights that we're tackling here.
Yes. So like Daniel mentioned before, this is very important, and it's also part of civil rights regulations. So Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a regulation that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin in all programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. And the focus of this requirement is to ensure that English learner students can participate meaningfully and equitably in educational programs. So some of the steps that they require is to make programs, services, and activities accessible for all eligible persons with limited English proficiency. And this, I will share a document on our chat, but here is a couple of documents. So here are some resources from the Office of Civil Rights, and you can find resources there in different languages. And I'm also sharing ELP, so a limited English proficiency document for parents and guardians, for schools and school districts to communicate with them. And that document talks a lot about what are the parameters of what school districts need to do. So it's just saying, for an example, what are the activities that should be covered? So it goes from registration, enrollment, report cards, also parents' handbooks. So it's just showing that this covers anything that a student and a parent or a student and families would be interacting with the school district. And it also talks about who in the school district can and should be doing the interpreting and translation, and how you identify those people in your school.
I'd love to take a quick pause because that was a lot of information covered just in the last 2 slides. Does anyone have any feedback or questions about that information in terms of the current landscape as Sean outlaid it, and then in terms of what we just saw in terms of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and some of those components that Maria brought up? Okay, great. Wonderful resources. We'll definitely make those available to you following this meeting as well, but definitely recommend reviewing it if you haven't seen it before. Let's keep it moving. And Maria, can you continue talking a little bit more about civil rights and language access?
Yes, if you look at those documents and you think about what the civil rights regulation is doing, is making sure that everyone that is connecting with any activity that is funded by the government has information, opportunity, can contribute to change, and can communicate autonomously with the school district. And like it's stated there, everyone deserves to be understood in the school district.
I'd love to touch on this last point, which is communicative autonomy. And this is one of the areas that interpreters are specifically coached on and trained on as they move through their process to become credentialed. Communicative autonomy means that as service providers or families that are receiving services, we're not there to provide a filter or to in any way, shape, or form change information that's being shared between parties. It's the role of the interpreter to make sure that the individual and the family are able to control their message and to be able to be understood in terms of what they themselves are communicating to you all. On the flip side, it's also to make sure that you all as service providers have that same degree of autonomy and that you are communicating the information that's so critical to their success in the way in the form in which you are engaging with them. And as Maria did such a great job of talking about, this is with that core concept in mind. Beyond any federal component or legislation, everyone deserves to be able to understand and to be understood when it comes to their engagement with their academic careers. Thank you so much, Maria. All right, Sean, can you talk a little bit about Student Success Act and the Oregon Department of Education?
Yeah, you got it. I think for several of you, there was a point in time on that language access agreement that we sent out where I added this to the bottom of that in the footer. And so this may look somewhat familiar to some, and maybe you haven't seen this before for others. But essentially, required in the Oregon Department of Education's integrated guidance, and granted also that there's new guidance coming out very soon, it still requires community engagement, and best practice in community engagement is providing language access for all of the information. It can look a variety of ways. The other thing is what the integrated guidance calls out for ESDs to do, which is support district access, which is why we've put forth an allocation. We'll get, I'm sorry, I forgot. If we go, we'll talk about some more in just a minute, but which is why we put forth this allocation. And now this year, we'll talk a little bit more in a second about why we're having this workshop series to help folks build a language access plan.
I'd love to learn more about those best practices for community engagement. Sean, would you mind expounding upon them a little bit?
Yeah, I think the next slide, right? Yeah, so community engagement, it's ongoing, which means it's not just we do it because we have a plan to submit. It means that we're constantly identifying if what we're doing is supporting the needs of all families, including those families who might be experiencing language barriers. Obviously, if we are doing things, we want to make informed decisions. And so when we know if it's working or if it's not working, it allows us to continue or to shift. When we are communicating and we're responsive to the needs, that's building the relationships. And oftentimes we have funding or we have groups that are already doing some work, and we can actually defer to them in terms of meeting their needs as a very specific demographic group, which we may not have tapped into before. And so deferring to those groups who are impacted to have them drive the decision, and then we're responsive within the parameters of the funding streams. That's where we get to have, really, that's where we get to have a lot of, relationship building. And I added this little component piece. Every time that we have an opportunity to connect with somebody that we're serving is an opportunity to build a relationship. So everyone is a constituent. And you have to like put yourself in the position of when you're in a space and you don't feel comfortable. Why don't you feel comfortable? What would make you feel more comfortable? Or when you feel comfortable, it's because of what? And oftentimes it comes down to being able to communicate directly with people. Indirect communication already creates a barrier. Not having any way to communicate with people, just absolutely others. And it puts me in a different box. And so this is, we'll talk a little bit more in a second here. So Daniel, I'm going to stop there.
I love it. Any feedback or questions when we're talking about community engagement as Sean has outlaid it here? Okay. So let's talk about the current issues. What are we seeing?
Yeah, so this is a regional issue. This is like a technical assistance program. That's what's kind of listed here. So we went into a pre-purchase the first biennium of the Student Success Act, about $186,000 to prepay to Linguava. We were actually, is the theory of action coming up soon? Because yeah,
we
it
can
is.
pop right over to it.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we allocated funds to the district, and we kind of the theory of action was if we offer this allocation, then more districts will access language services and meet more needs. But we found that it was completely underutilized. And so the theory of action we're operating or shifting to is not just the allocation, and it was to Linguava. That was the first one, was like specifically Linguava. And my friends at Linguava, Crystal, who's on the call, who you didn't get to meet, Crystal Brown, she's been really a big supporter on this. Daniel and Sarah. It's not about using Linguava. It's about creating language access or enhancing local language services. Linguava can certainly help do that, but they're one of many language service providers. They just happen to be, we don't need to have 100 contracts with 100 different providers. We've got one contract, a consortium rate. They do a lot of good work for us, so we rely on them very heavily at the WESD, and we can give you our districts a very low rate. But if we, as we shift, offer the allocation to the districts to enhance local language service, that gives districts a lot more autonomy, and offer support to create the language access plan. That's going to give you as leaders and the folks in your buildings, your principals, your secretaries, maybe your counselors, your EL teachers, going to give them a more of a pathway to be accessing services to meet more needs. So now it's not going to be all on you, a building or a district leader, to try to control the funding, try to control the pathways. You're going to help set a pathway so everybody can funnel through. And yes, there's going to be things outside of that, but you're going to have a lot more management capability without having to manage so much. And so that's where we're going with this. Dan, if you can pop back to the previous slide real quick.
Absolutely.
Thank you. The question that keeps coming up, and Holly is going to be one of these people that can totally attest to this. Across the region, there's just limited knowledge of how to access services. And that has come up, and that is not a person issue. I want to make it clear, if you're a person in control of the services, it is not your fault. It is a system issue. There is no system in place that can easily be communicated or that was co-developed with constituents so that everybody can access. So, some of the blaming that goes on in different pockets, it really is a system issue. There is no teeth from the state, and that's not a blaming statement either, really. It's just there is no teeth behind language access plans. But we do know, and this is totally concrete, look at all of your grants and all of your integrated funding. There are specific plans, and that money gets spent and work gets done. When we have a specific plan around language access, we can totally help folks work within that system to utilize these funds and get some work done, which is meeting more needs. And then this one is true, and this one just came up, and we'll share some information later on, but not today, at a future meeting. But there is, and Maria already mentioned this, that there's a high risk of violations under civil rights. Everybody is just a phone call away from a civil rights issue. And if you've ever seen one of your students translating at conferences for their parents, right, or interpreting for their parents, right, or interpreting at different meetings, and sometimes it's our youngest kids, 7, 8 years old, they don't even have the language capacity to be in that position of interpreter. It's also when we when we give these stipends to our folks who are bilingual, that does not make them qualified translators or interpreters. That is another issue that we want to try to mitigate. So having this access to these funds can actually help with training for those folks who are already receiving a stipend, but it actually will give them the opportunity to learn how to be an appropriate translator or interpreter. So just a couple of things to noodle on. I would say be reasonably worried about, just to address it, because we know that these can be issues that we want to try to avoid.
Love it. Beautifully stated. Any questions or feedbacks about the theories of action that have undergone during the different periods of time with WESD support, both in the past and then moving forward in this new period? I just love to jump in real quick because I happen to have a unique opportunity today. I mentioned earlier at the start of our session, I'm actually an interpreter myself. And Crystal can attest, I still love to get out in the field and provide interpretive services. And just this morning, actually, at about 10 o'clock, I jumped in as a last minute resource for an immediate appointment that came in for a school setting. And there was a counselor that was engaging with a senior that was missing the last steps in their credits. This wasn't a WESD school or one of your districts. I can attest to that as well. And they were looking to engage with the parent because the communication was traveling through the student and there was limited information that was being provided. But once that counselor was able to engage directly with the parent, they were able to come up with a plan for next actions, where the student in that same situation was not being a reliable interpreter or translator. Beyond the Title VI component, as we mentioned in civil rights, it's how are we making sure that that communication is being transmitted successfully? And I've seen it many times as an interpreter before. It's critical to have an impartial third party that's able to reliably communicate the information being shared by your service providers, counselors, students, and secretaries, as Sean outlined a minute ago. And I just love the fact that I was able to do an education interpretation session this morning, so I can speak firsthand to everything Sean was describing. So moving on from WESD's theories of action, I'd love to pass it back to Maria to talk a little bit about her role and how this ties in with this workshop series.
Yes, so one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is how you can use Equity Lens as you're building your language access plan. And this is something that the Department of Education does talk about also in the integrated guidance. They encourage the adoption and use of Equity Lens or an equity decision tool when you're developing plans that will impact your community. And what an equity lens or an equity decision tool does is that it creates a systemic structure that will ensure that none of the focal groups or any of your community will be missed in the process of creating a community engagement plan, or in this case, a language access plan that will impact that community. So anytime that you're developing something this big that has this big impact in the community, using an equity lens can make sure that you are not missing big aspects of it. So what I want to do is make sure that you all know that I'm here, and that if you want to use an equity lens tool while creating this document, that we can look at it through an equity lens tool and make sure that it's accessible and inclusive, that it's using accessible and inclusive language, that it's addressing any implicit bias, or that we're being aware of any implicit bias that may be coming up as we're writing them. And that it's also addressing gaps in services and making plans for it in the future. And that we can continue articulating any plans that we have, if that makes sense. And here's my contact information. So that's my email. I can also put that on the chat. And I will be here for all of our sessions. You can always contact me here whenever we see each other, but also please feel free to email me at any point if you have questions. And I'll also put on the chat the equity lens from ODE that I have mentioned. And this specific equity lens is focused on race and ethnicity, and it's focusing on articulating shared goals from those questions. So it has 8 questions to think about as you are creating documents. And it is one of the equity lenses out there, but if that one doesn't resonate with your district needs, we can find another one that fits better what you need right now.
And if I can just add just a little like application, couple things I've learned over the last 4 years. When we first started with applying the equity lens to build a plan, I will just say, I was like, I don't even know what that means. I don't know what it means to apply an equity lens. And the beauty of the role I have is I get to work with all of our 21 districts, and I'm constantly talking about what it means to apply an equity lens. And so it's just become part of my nature. It's just how I operate. Now, I don't know how each of you operates with an equity lens, so I just wanted to give a couple examples and actually give you a very specific opportunity to really go back and apply an equity lens to this work that we're doing in building a language access plan. And what I like you to do, hopefully you have something to write with. I want you to write who in your district that you work with, either at a building, at the district level, who is somebody that is employed with you in the district that would be impacted by you trying to create a language access plan. So someone who's going to be an approver, someone who's going to do some work of translating, interpreting, you should write their names down. Take a minute or two and write those names down. It doesn't have to be an exhaustive list because you're going to ask them the same question. Who else? You should write those down. I think it's super appropriate. This is applying an equity lens. Checking the time here. About 10 more seconds or so. I know sometimes it seems long, but it's short if you're writing. Okay, the next question I want to ask you to do some work on, write this down. Of the parents that you're in communication with, who are some of those parents of limited English proficiency who are the lead communicators, especially for the constituent group, whether it's one language or multiple languages, whether it's multiple people because of the diverse languages that exist within your district context. And it doesn't have to be all. Start with one or two that you know. And if you don't know the one or two lead communicators, the parents primarily, then who in your district would know them? Now, as we go about the rest of this workshop today, it is very content heavy. And so you're going to be taking some notes. We'll share out the recording with all of you afterwards. It's going to be extremely rich and absolutely an application of the equity lens to take some of this information and share it with folks, at least what you're doing. Hey, I want to work on building a language access plan. I'm going to need your input. I want to set up some times when I can defer to you, when I can pick your brain about what it might look like, or tell me about what's worked with our process currently, or tell me about how our process could be better. Open-ended questions, not closed binary yes or no questions. Open-ended questions. Seek their ideas and input. Don't seek their approval or disapproval. So open-ended questions, also an application of an equity lens. Those are very concrete, almost the easier parts of navigating with equity. There's deeper parts that you can see in those equity lenses, but just a couple of very specific things that I would highly encourage you to do after this workshop, before the next workshop. Check in with at least a couple of those and ask how would you like to be involved in this process. So that's my Maria, I hope that didn't steal your thunder too much, but I know it can be hard from my experience, it can be hard without specific, what does that look like? And so hopefully that was a good example, and that gives you an opportunity to go back and do actually apply the equity lens. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And the equity lens is something that it's helpful to be aware of as we're building any document, in this case, the language access plan. It is something that we'll always be going back to. And like you said, the more you use it, the more it's something that becomes more normal to you to use. It's something that becomes more like a usual process. And also I was gonna say, it is something that at the beginning, you might see the equity lens in one way, and as we're moving forward, at the end, you might look at the equity lens and use it in a different way in your, just to make sure that there isn't any gaps. So this is a fluid process. I appreciate any input here. And also let me know if you have any other questions about this, about what we can do, and I'm always happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Maria and Sean. Really great questions that we're going to circle back around on, not just at the end of today's session, but throughout our conversation for the next this session and the next 3 sessions as well. So now that we've established, again, that current landscape and talked about it, one of the things that we wanted to do in this first session is to establish language access fundamentals. So I'm going to move on to talking about some core key concepts that are going to help guide how we go about crafting our conversations with our constituents, how we go about creating this tool that we're aiming to create for each district, which is a language access plan. And to do so, we're going to be focusing on some definitions to remember that are available from lep.gov. We referenced them earlier today. There are some really great resources that are available for free on lep.gov. I'm putting the link here in the chat as well. Things that include I Speak cards that you can make available to students and families, language access guides and resources that have been pre-translated with some base scripts as well. There's also posters for folks to be able to indicate their language preference, and other resources that you can find, including language assistance self-assessments that we're going to share a shortened version of at the end of today's session. So some of the core concepts that we're going to be discussing briefly in the time that remains today, you can see here on the screen, and we're going to go through them bit by bit. So starting off our conversation about limited English proficiency and those folks that need or prefer to receive information in a language other than English. Got a quick question for you. What does that mean when we're talking about limited English proficiency, and how would that differ from someone who's an English learner? What do you think the distinction is?
I mean, I obviously just a guess. When we think of English learners, you know, in our district, we're tending to differentiate between, you know, their language acquisition journey from an academic perspective and from a social perspective. And so our English language learners, we're not assessing whether or not they're socially competent with their language. It's whether or not they're academically competent with their language. And by competent, I just mean obviously proficient within the ELPA domains. But, you know, that limited English proficiency, as I would interpret it, probably spans both social and academic language competencies.
Love it, Creighton. Really great ideas, great feedback. Does anyone else want to add or share their own thoughts about the distinctions here?
I think the connections to federal legislation are a part of it. The English learners, I understand, is rooted in Title III, and limited English proficient is rooted in civil rights law.
Beautifully stated. Yeah, there's definitely some distinctions there as well. Any other thoughts? So as was stated by both Creighton and Todd, these terms have legal connotations and definitions that apply to the way these programs and funding operate in terms of how they're engaging with services at their academic levels as well. But one thing to consider is that limited English proficiency in many instances can come across as diminutive when we're talking about equity. Obviously, this is the term that is used by the federal government, but it almost sounds like a deficiency when framed in a certain perspective. These folks are coming to the table at a disadvantage when framed in this way. And when we're focusing on that equity lens, one of the things we want to understand is that many of the families that we work with, many of the students, have varying degrees or capacities of engagement with English in terms of how they engage with services, how they engage socially, how they engage in their academic career or outside of it. Does anyone here speak any other languages besides Maria or myself? Holly, what other languages do you speak?
I speak Spanish, and I was gonna pipe in right before you shared, so I'm really glad you went there because we've chosen to use other terms. I know that they're legal definitions, federal terms, but they are very subtractive. So thank you for sharing that.
Would you mind sharing some of the other terms that you've discussed or deployed in your district?
We use multilingual and emergent bilingual primarily. We talk about families and students adding English to their repertoire of languages.
I love those. Those are great ideas to kind of percolate and to think about in terms of how you bring these conversations back to your constituents and frame that as you've developed these tools. One of the images I wanted to depict here, as you can see, on the left-hand side, we've got someone with a spotlight on them, right? It's an individual. This is the limited English proficient person, right? Whereas English learners, or some of those great terms we heard, like emergent bilingual, represents a much wider swath of the population. Some folks speak limited Spanish, right? They might be able to handle their own in a kitchen setting. Maybe they can refer to specific items that are a part of that workspace if they've engaged with folks in that environment, or in a gardening space. Maybe they've worked at a nursery and have some experience working with some other folks in those capacities. The same may apply to other individuals in other settings. Many of the families, parents, and students that we work with may have English available to them in limited ranges, in the same way that some folks may have that available in Spanish or additional languages. So when we think about English learners, when we think about these emergent bilinguals, a way of framing the conversation that is more inclusive of all parties is a critical component of how we go about crafting that equity lens focused language access plan that we'd like for each of us to be able to come up with through this process. Any thoughts or questions about that as we continue to move on? Thank you all for sharing, and please continue to do so. I'm going to ask more questions as we move through it. So now that we've identified, again, those who will benefit most from having access to language services to bring them up to par with their access and their ability to, again, participate in activities and programs as we described them earlier on. One of the things we want to talk about is, what does it mean to have meaningful language access, right? What does that actually do for the folks that are going to be benefiting from language services? And when we talk about that, one of those key concepts that we want to establish is effective communication. Now, the image on the left is something we see oftentimes in descriptions and conversations about equity, right? But the key idea that we're looking for in terms of effective communication, as Maria and Sean did such a great job of describing it, is that that information that is provided by academic centers, the district, and the schools is available to all parties, that they have access to the information that they need to be able to participate in activities. Whether that's report cards for them to be able to be maintaining themselves abreast of the academic career of their student, or permission slips for field trips. If they are going to be informed on the risks and benefits of a particular activity, it's beneficial to make sure that these sorts of communications that are coming officially from the school are available in these settings. Again, it's critical when we think about effective communication, not just to think about what's sufficient to provide an LEP individual or person with a non-English language proficiency, but to be able to make sure that they are taking reasonable steps to ensure that that access is available for all folks to participate in a meaningful fashion. And with effective communication in mind, there's another component, which is not just that this information be available, but that it be available in a timely fashion. Are folks going to be significantly delayed in their participation in activities and programs because it's going to take a period of time for that information to be made available to them? We want to make sure that folks are not delayed or receive inferior services because of a lack of training or protocol or procedure on the part of the districts or the individuals in how they provide those services to constituents. So a key part of our language access planning is going to be making sure that folks know how to, they're trained on accessing these services. They have a central database or resource, a tool that they can turn to when they have questions, and that key people within the district are available to them as resources as well. Again, as we talked about with Title VI, there are these requirements that come from a legislative side, but there's untold benefits to making sure that meaningful access is available to those individuals in these settings. Now, we heard from Holly, right? She's got a bit of a Spanish background. A lot of folks have bilingual staff that work in these settings as well. And I'm curious, how many here have bilingual staff that work within their districts? Yeah. So one of the things that we want to identify is the distinction between a bilingual helper and a credentialed interpreter or translator. It's important to remember that bilingual helpers, those staff who are available to be guideposts and to direct individuals towards services, are a critical component of the services that are offered on a daily basis. They may be the people that folks know to reach out to if they have questions that they can engage with directly. Ideally, a bilingual helper is not just someone who's bilingual, but they have demonstrated proficiency in English and a target language. They ideally have demonstrated that they have oral capacity as well, if you're going to be deploying them in a way where they support language services. One of the things to keep in mind is that interpreters and translators aren't just bilingual. They've been trained specifically in core concepts and ethics and standards of practice in order to make sure, as we discussed earlier on, that communicative autonomy is always achieved. They're not there to filter messages. They're there to make sure that all information is shared. Again, bilingual helpers should not extend to family members. When we're talking about engaging with students, we should never put a student in a position of being, again, the interpreter or the translator for their parents, in terms of being a faithful narrator and making sure that they get to be students, right? And abide by Title VI as we described it earlier. Any questions about the distinctions between bilingual staff and then having an interpreter or a translator available for some of these resources? Okay. Well, just touching on it again, there was a great handout that Maria shared in the chat, but vital documents are those documents that help to make sure that folks are able to engage with services in a timely fashion. So one of the things that we'd like to focus on are those vital documents, whether they be registration or enrollment documentation. Grievance procedures are super critical. If folks have a complaint or have a concern, how are they able to communicate that message back to the district? And is that information or procedure available to them in their home language? Notices of non-discrimination, again, as we talked about, are available for free at lep.gov. And you can take some of those existing documents and recraft them to your specific needs as well. Some other ideas are available here, but one of the things we're going to be talking about as a group over the next couple of sessions is identifying what those vital documents look like for your specific use cases and the folks that you're working with. There's obviously some overlap, but again, creating a central hub for those resources as well. Any questions there with the vital documents piece? All right. Well, we've gotten some great questions from Sean earlier on, right? To go back to what Sean said about a half a presentation ago, one of the things that we're going to ask you all to do is to come away from this session and go and do some introspection, to talk with your constituents, to talk with staff within your district. So some of the ideas, as we described them earlier, is who is someone in the district that's going to be impacted, right, by having a language access plan, the way that Sean defined it. So when we're looking at students and parents that have a non-English home language, some other questions to ask yourself might be, where and how is this preference being documented within the district or the schools that support those students. And then an awareness component. Now that you've documented, if that information is being documented, who has access to that information? And does that information impact the way that communication occurs with a student? Does the parent have to ask for a translation, or is that being made available as a part of the process of their enrollment within the school based on identified needs? So what we're going to ask you to do is to take home some of this information and ask around. If you haven't identified it already, who holds this information? And how is it communicated internally amongst internal stakeholders? What changes does that trigger in terms of the behavior that the school or the district has with the students? And as we saw earlier, Sean shared some really great demographics right up till today's date. Are there currently any of those demographics available for the district that you're working in? And what do those demographics look like for yourselves? So bringing that information to our next session so that we can talk about the specific needs of your landscape will be incredibly beneficial to make sure that the language access plan we develop together is specific to those specific goals and needs that you have. Another thing we're going to ask you to take a look at are any existing translations. Do they exist somewhere? And if they do, who knows where they're housed? Where are they housed? How is that information shared in those different places? And do any of those documents need to be created or updated? Have they been updated in English, but you're looking at a version of it for Spanish or Mandarin that may be 5 or 10 years old in the past as well? So again, what we're going to ask you to do is to do some introspection here and just take a look at some of these existing landscape pieces and existing resources and assess what's currently available, who knows it's there, and then we're going to move forward from that starting point in our next couple of sessions to build upon that foundation, strengthen those services, and make sure that staff have a procedure and a policy in place to engage with them when there's a time and a need for each of them. Sean, we've got some questions coming in.
Yeah, Brian, I love the question. Like I could give you a million things to do. I think it's interesting though, because also it depends on local context and what you know, what you don't know. And if I give you a list of things and one of them takes you 3 hours and that's the only thing you do, is that going to be the thing that drives the needle? So I want to be careful in a to-do list, and maybe at the end we can talk about what might be the most appropriate next steps, and you can consider based on your context. But I love where you're thinking there.
So one tool that we had created in the past, it's not built by Linguava or WSD, comes straight from lep.gov, is a self-assessment. And we've pared it down. There's a longer version of this same self-assessment that you can take upon yourselves from lep.gov. But if you'd like to, a simple activity would be to go through these 10 questions that I'm sharing in the form of a Google form and kind of identify some of these key points. There are 10 questions in total, gives you an opportunity to have a starting place. So I would say for the next session, answer these questions, find this information. What is the current landscape? So what we want to know is, again, who has access to that information? Where are those resources housed? And we'll start from there, because again, we're building a foundation in this first session so that in the next session, in the third and the fourth, we're able to come together and share some existing resources and strengthen that language access plan so that you have a living, vibrant document that provides guidance to staff and support to students and families. Other questions, concerns, or feedback?
So I had to step out for a moment, but I'll just say, generally speaking, I really appreciate this. I think, you know, my district, you know, addressing this, and I've had long conversations with Sean about this as well, but, you know, addressing this kind of a plan and the needs in this area are really critical. We have so many instances where our language needs exceed what our resources are. And we don't really have a codified plan. We don't really have I mean, everything is just kind of, you know, put together on the fly, and who do we have available? And, even in my various capacities, one of them is special education, and I cringe every once in a while when we have an IEP meeting that requires translation and we don't have somebody available, and we're just trying to figure it out. And Linguava stepped in before a couple of times for us, but being able to think this through more strategically and really put something in place that is more permanent and codified, I think will just kind of help define how important this need is for our district and our community, and et cetera, et cetera. So I appreciate this conversation and the work we're going to do, because it's I think it's taken for granted, probably in many districts, but those of my ilk that my district's 70% Hispanic Latino, and we're over 40% ELs. So you can just imagine, but we're monolingual English teaching environment, and the majority of our staff are, not bilingual, and they're English only. So we come up against this problem a lot. And so being able to put some real thought into it, I think is really student focused and family focused.
Great, and thank you so much for sharing that. That was wonderful, and I'm glad that this has proven meaningful in our first session. And what we're hoping is that we're just going to grow from here. We're coming to the end of our first session today. We did want to leave time for questions and discussion, but I'd love to hear from anyone else if you have thoughts or feedback about this first session, or your hopes or goals for how we continue to move forward.
I have a question about the self-assessment Google form.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that we're submitting it and it's going into your department, Sean, the responses of the self-assessment.
Yeah, so it goes to Daniel. He's the owner of that document. He's going to share that information with us. I'm going to I'm going to take a little bit of an assumption here and make the suggestion that, and Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong here, multiple people in your district should complete it. If you've got the same district, we'll filter that down, because if multiple people are answering these questions similarly or differently, it's going to help you identify from that self-assessment where you're at.
So what you're suggesting is that we use it as a tool to share out, to gather data, that you will, maybe you're going to filter it and share back our district data with us. I guess I'm just wondering, how are we using this?
We will 100% get it back to you.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And while, again, I am the quote unquote owner, if you're familiar with Google Forms, I've made Sean and Maria collaborators on that form. So they're going to receive live updates anytime someone puts in information. We can get it in a spreadsheet fashion so that we can provide to you actual tangible results from anyone who submits on that form.
I just think it's important for people to know when they're filling out a survey, what and how the information is going to be used.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Totally, Holly. And I just shared with all of you, I actually did kind of the same thing that we can do with the data that gets. So I asked ODS when I saw who was coming today, once we had the final list, I said, hey, can you give me the most up-to-date student language counts? And they gave me a spreadsheet with all of the districts, and I separated that into individual spreadsheets, and I just shared that with each of you individually. And so as we get more folks on the call, I want to share that out, because that is also a part of operating or implementing an equity lens. What's the data say? How many students are we working with here, right? What's the context? And knowing that and having that communication, it really helps drive some next steps in your process. So yes, we can totally get that for you, Holly. And I would say if I'm not getting it to you fast enough, and that people have submitted the form, just ask me and I'll work and get it to you. It doesn't take too long to get that information broken down and to you.
How broad are you suggesting that we go with that?
Oh, gosh. Daniel, I don't know if you've got a recommendation on that.
I would leave it in your hands, because this is, again, information that's going to come back to you. So in terms of what sort of a net you would like to cast and who you would like to involve in it, will determine, I think, the contributions that you get from your specific district. I would definitely agree with Sean. It would be beneficial for you to include a couple stakeholders, and get those responses, as long as they provide that information about the organization specific, we can make sure to tie it all back together and pass it back to you with a bow so that you have that data based on those results.
Is there also hope to use it kind of as pre and maybe sometime post data for this work as a whole?
Yeah, we could do a before and after for sure. I love that idea.
Yeah, it's hard on the self-assessments because it's quite, it's quite binary, yes, no. Part of the issue always with a form like this is the language. Some folks, it may be occurring, but they might not have the same language context, so they may not understand the context of the question based on the terminology used. And so, which is fine, because that just gives you an opportunity to let's define these terms. And so that could be a conversation you have with some key folks. Now, Holly, if I'm in your shoes, knowing what I think I know about Central, if I'm going to kind of scope this out, your key constituents are going to be you if you're at the district level, probably your building principals. I don't know that it needs to be 100% at this moment, because you kind of want to start small and scale up, or maybe start with your elementaries and then go secondary, because you got the 2 secondaries and you got what, 3, 4 elementaries. 3. So, you can do it in 2 groups that way, but in those contexts, it won't necessarily be the principal submitting the things. And we'll talk about in upcoming workshops. It will very likely be a secretary or an ELD teacher. And so you have to consider who in the building is going to do that. You've got already probably stipend folks who are doing some translation interpreting. They might be accessing the plan more often. Then you're going to need a gen ed teacher, if you've got PLCs and you've got, these are all the things that I'm considering. If I'm back in a building, or if I'm at a district level, if my PLCs are going to be sending out a newsletter and I've got, and I'm trying to do some PLC work, I want all my 3rd grade teachers sending out a consistent message for the school, or maybe for the district, like this is what's happening in 3rd grade around state testing, right? I want a similar letter going to all my constituents at the same time. So I'm going to funnel that up, 1 letter versus 3 letters at 3 different buildings, or even worse, 9 or maybe 12 letters at 3 different buildings, right? That's how we can mitigate some of the unintended costs associated with translation. That's how we empower people to work within a system that we've created with them. And so get a key communicator at a building to weigh in on this. As a start, grow from there. Is that helpful, Holly?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, if there are any other questions, again, you have Maria's contact information, Sean's as well. Feel free to direct those questions to them. Sarah on our team as well can answer questions regarding your specific accounts with Linguava if those come up as a separate issue. But planning with that end in mind, what we really want to focus on is that core concept that everyone deserves to be understood. Everyone deserves to have access to information and participate in their academic careers and the opportunities that are so available and abundant in your districts. So if there are no other questions at this time, we look forward. Oh, yeah, Sean, jump in.
I might just share, I know I've emailed it out there, but session 2, the next session, start with what you know, schedules and services. So, and we'll follow up with an email. So obviously Brian indicated some next steps, and it's very, we can definitely have some generalizations around, talk to some people to collect some information, or let them know, hey, there's a process going on. How would you like to be involved? And we'll put out some of those considerations for you. Next session is schedules and services. Now, depending on your level and where you want to go and how you kind of want to roll this out, don't think, if you're thinking oh my gosh, this is so big and it's so broad, then don't start so broad. Narrow it down to either your primary or your secondary, and start smaller. You can always scale it up, but think of the schedules. From a district level, you might be thinking some very specific events that are going on, and so you want to bring those to the table. Probably the most Near, if you haven't done it already, is forecasting. We know that forecasting is going on very soon. If you haven't had them yet, maybe it's conferences right now that are coming up after spring break. Maybe you got a spring conferences. Maybe it's state testing, right? Some of these state testing might have gone out already last month or something, but then you've got summer programming. If you've got anything that needs to be communicated there, you've got registration in the fall. You've got fall events. If I'm at secondary level, maybe I've got my extracurriculars, right? And so think about those things that occur every year in your district. And you can set that example from a district level, and then you can empower your principals. Hey, I need a list of your events, and they probably already have them. I know a lot of your people that you're working with, they probably already have a schedule of events for next year. And you would want to empower them. What services do you need at these events? Are you going to need things translated? Are you going to need things interpreted? And then you can start getting or letting them get into the weeds around that. And that's how you kind of create that system. And then as a building, as a district person, you can actually start looking at, okay, what are some potential costs around these things? How can we make sure that we've got some timelines set up so we're funneling some things appropriately, not trying to, okay, we only need to share this information. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that example of, I've got 12 third grade teachers. Are they each going to have a letter translated? Or am I going to have each building translate a letter for that set of teachers? Or is it more of a district approach and it's going to be the same letter for that whole group, right? It does take a lot of planning, but you tie it to the system. I didn't say Holly, I didn't say Brian, I didn't say Creighton or Todd or Becca. I said your third grade team. I said your building secretary. I said your EL teacher, whoever you are at the district level, right? That's your position. It's not a person, it's a position. You're just doing the work in that position right now. But so some of those things to consider, schedules and services is what we'll cover next time. I'll send out, kind of the to-dos. Third one, identifying requesters and approvers. You might already be thinking about that right now. So we might shift that one depending on what comes up next time, because any of these topics could change. But determining how they will engage with the plan. So once you get your schedule and once you get your things, then it's like, how are those folks who are requesting and approving, how are they going to be engaging with the process? And then the last one is really digging into that flow chart, and we'll have some actual documents that you can create based on some tools that we already have available from McMinnville's. They've allowed us to use theirs as a resource, and certainly you'd want to, if you already have something, you want to bring it in. And so anyway, that was just kind of a preview for what's coming up, but definitely we'll follow up with information and some next steps, what to prepare for between now and the next time. Holly.
I have a wondering.
Yeah.
Back to the survey. So I know that the federal definition is LEP. I just don't know if there's any way to represent it like on the survey, like multilingual parentheses LE. I don't know. I just know that in our district, if I share that with staff, not everyone will be appreciative of the term. And also the deaf, hard of hearing, just depending on the staff that get the survey, they may or may not see that DHOH. I think it's saying deaf, hard of hearing. How does your organization identify individuals with LEP or who are D/HOH? Anyway, I just wonder if everyone will automatically catch that. That's what that means.
And definitely update the terminology on the evaluation to include multilingual as well. And we can spell out the full acronym in all instances to make sure that that is communicated in the way that you're addressing, because obviously acronyms are shorthand for folks that are familiar with the concepts, but if we want to make sure that we're getting accurate information, we can make that adjustment, and I'll take care of that today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I know, spring break coming up. I think I got it right here. Our next event is on the 16th. So it gives us 2 weeks after spring break. I will do my best to try to get something by Friday. If not, you'll have it by Monday after spring break. If I can help you avoid doing work over spring break, because I know you got a million things and some of you might already be planning on doing something, but maybe you're just gonna take a big vacation. That'd be awesome. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording then.